Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the panel that we've assembled today. I can assure you that everyone that's on this panel is an expert, and I have a lot of respect for them. But the panel is called Airport Challenges, and believe me, there are a lot going on because our whole business is changing. Welcome, first of all, to the panel. Today's panelists are going to address a subject that's really dear to my heart, and that's the ground component in air logistics, because I believe that aircraft can move at such a speed. There's not much change over the past years, but everything that happens on the ground is what differentiates us one from the other, one airport from the other, one ground handling company from the other. It's what we can do on the ground and the services we provide to airlines, which will allow them to introduce products. The products that we need are the things that are competitive against the new threats. That's one thing, but also against the new consumer expectations. If you talk about Alibaba asking for anything, anywhere in 72 hours, how are we going to do that if we don't fix what's on the ground? So to the panel, let me say a big thank you to all of you. I know it's busy times for everybody. We're getting into the peak now in October, so you taking the time out to speak to our audience today is really, really appreciated. As we go through the products, perhaps the three of you can think of something which we can talk about at the end of the panel, which is things that you could share with us that we could put in place as an agenda item to try to challenge ourselves for the coming year. And maybe we can discuss it next year where hopefully we can all meet in person in Rome instead of virtual. Virtual is good, but one-on-one interfacing and networking is even better. And if you could maybe jot down a note, if you can give us at the end of the show a bit of an idea of what you think we could work on for the next year to bring things back better, which is what we all want to do, of course. We have so much to go through, so I'll take the lead and sort of briefly introduce all of you so that we can spend the time on interaction between us. And I have some questions for the panel. I also have some individual questions based on your disciplines, so bear with me. First and foremost, I want to introduce Stephanie Weir. Stephanie is the Director of Air Service Development and Cargo Services at Philadelphia International Airport in the United States. Welcome, Stephanie. Thanks for joining us. Stephanie's responsible for air service development and the cargo portfolio at the airport. And as Stephanie joined Philly when they actually got involved heavily in air cargo way prior to COVID-19. So it'll be very interesting to hear why they took those decisions a few years ago and where it's going. Stephanie facilitates the corporate and stakeholder relationships that maximize commercial air services, but also, very important, a big part of her portfolio is cargo. She holds an MBA and a master's degree in marketing and communications, so welcome, Stephanie. Mammen, Tharakan, I hope I pronounced that last part. I only know you by Mammen, so I apologize for that. I got a complete disclosure here. We're both KLM alumni, so we have that claim to fame or infamy, whatever way you want to look at it, Mammen. Mammen has a very broad portfolio at Edmonton. He's responsible for all of the e-commerce, the real estate development, the route development. He has a very broad portfolio there, and Edmonton is really exciting things going on for it, and a lot of developmental things that are really important, and sharing them with us would be great, Mammen. His duties include identifying new technologies and partnerships, also supporting passage and cargo, of course, but recognizing the crucial role that air cargo plays. He's been spending a lot of time on that lately, and we're so happy you can share with us what you learned. He holds a master's degree in business admin from Hull University in the United States. Welcome, Mammen. Steve Forer, he's from the company AFCO. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief Investment Officer. AFCO is a division of Goldman Sachs. Welcome, Steve. We're really looking forward to hear from you with all the investments you have around the world. You must be particularly in tune with what's going on. He joined AFCO in 2011. He's responsible for the overall investments and business development initiatives of the company. He's been over 37 years, diversified portfolio of disciplines within the real estate division. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Finance from Virginia Tech, and he's a Master of Business Admin from the George Washington University. So welcome, Steve. Looking forward to hear from you as well. And Stewart, well, Stewart's a legend in everyone's mind. Stewart is I can't get the words out that say retired. It just doesn't make sense to me that you retired. Stewart and I go back a long way, as you can probably tell. It's a man I hold in very high esteem. He's now defining himself as an independent consultant. Well, I would say independent genius when it comes to what we're about to talk about. He's got over 30 years in the aviation industry, and he spent that with various companies, but most notably with Donata, while Donata and Emirates were building up, I think, one of the stellar products in both aviation and also ground and all the services associated. Stewart responsible for Donata's global ground handling operations at over 90 airports around the world. So his opinion and his viewpoints on the global scene is going to be quite interesting. He graduated in economics from the University of Warwick in England, Scotland. And Stewart qualified also as a chartered accountant with Price Waterhouse in London. So that being said, that was get it through, but I think it'll give the audience a good appreciation of who you are and what we are. So let's talk a little bit about what we're here to talk about today. And then I want to push this over to you as quickly as I can. So the topic in the agenda was airport challenges. And when we put the message out and invited you to join this panel, basically what we thought from our side, and we're more interested in hearing from you, is amid these massive challenges in the businesses of airports, you've been adapting to meet some rather extraordinary changes over the past 24 months, roughly, since COVID hit. There's no doubt about it. I mean, shutdowns. I know both Edmonton and Philly were affected by government mandates. You've been in situations where the expectations of the customers are completely changing because of e-commerce and the rapid increase in the use of e-commerce. You've seen situations thrown at you, such as, for example, freighters. I hate that word, by the way, but I mean the workload and the handling of those aircraft is just incomprehensible. You wouldn't even accept an airplane like that a few years ago, but we had no choice because of the COVID crisis. So what we've seen now is that you have to look at things like adapting digital solutions, expanding and building new automated and efficient cargo terminals. Steve, here's where we want to talk to you, and supporting the airport infrastructure and coordinating all these change to ensure that the airlines that serve your airports can offer some competitive products, because if we don't, we know what's going to happen, it's going to do. So moving by air cargo by air is the easy part, as we said before. It's what happens on the ground that's going to differentiate us, and let's talk about that. So you've also had a chance to see what ICAO Courtney's had to say, and top down, I can tell you what the UN is calling for with single window initiatives for transparency, what the UN is calling for safety and security, and also economic and environmental sustainability. We've got some challenges we may not have a choice but to accept, and if we prepare in advance, they'll be much less painless. So let's get into a few things. I have a first question, which is for the whole panel, really. It seems that reading the press that COVID brought on some very, very unique challenges. And I must say, you all stood tall in handling things like PPE and vaccines when called upon. Since then, it seems all hell has broken loose in sea and air freight, especially in North America, with horror stories of delays and cargo taking, in some cases, weeks to move out of major airports. What were your experiences, and if any lessons learned over the past months that you had to cope with all this, and could you share them? Maybe we could start with you, Stephanie, and go sort of a roundtable. How was it for Philadelphia?
It's been an interesting 12 months for certain. And, you know, I think what it did is cemented the importance of cargo and its role in the community more than ever. And airports are economic drivers of their communities, and they're really important to the people surrounding them. So it was a challenge. We were not able to receive any passenger flights for several months because we were not named one of the funneling airports in the United States. There's original 13 airports that were allowed to receive international flights. So we lost a lot of our belly cargo. But what we saw was carriers that decided to very quickly change over. And so you saw American Airlines, for example, that had not operated a cargo only flight since 1984, start to really put in a lot of cargo flights. And obviously that changed our operational side. And we sort of had to switch for that. And we had a lot of one-time off, very unique charter flights that would come in with PPE, with, we have this story about mice serum that needed to come in within 24 hours because it's a critical element in testing for COVID, and how we had to make sure that that carrier had a ground handler set up in less than 24 hours and could fly and give them priority coming into the airport. So being very agile and cementing the fact that you need to be a cargo friendly airport, and you need to be responsive, and you need to be a good partner, because those are things that the airlines look very favorably upon, and it makes the whole logistics chain work.
Well, that's great. I mean, coping with that must have been really on your feet 24/7. I can imagine. Stewart, what were some of the experiences that Donata faced during all this? Because with being in 90 countries, you must have seen some stories to tell of critical success, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, of course, I mean, to echo what Stephanie was saying, we had this dramatic drop off in the passenger flights, which was 2/3 of our business. So our business, like everyone else, became entirely dependent on cargo. And I think that the one thing I'd sort of like to draw out from our experiences actually was the people. The way I think we probably all can, and I don't think this is just from my former employer, Donata, I think this is probably most companies. I think we underestimated the initiative and drive of our people, and how resourceful and agile they were going to be to respond to this. And it's extraordinary because it happened at a time where none of us quite knew what was going to happen the next day. And the ability of our people to really stand up, I found quite humbling, and I don't think it's unique to our organization. I think a lot of people had the same situation, and that reflected itself in many ways, whether it was quickly, people, our industry is known for people being in fixed roles, that this is the role I do, and it's the role I've done for 10 years, and I'm not doing the next guy's job. Well, that suddenly went out the window 18 months ago, and you started to see people being flexible. I think the crisis was so bad that it really brought out the best in people. I mean, we hear that on the news, don't we, in terms of personal, nice stories of acts of kindness going on, but it was definitely happening in the workplace too. And, if you look at we'll talk about it later, I'm sure, but the amount of innovation that has happened in the last 18 months compared with the previous 10 years. And what's really exciting about that is that has not come from corporate head office. Most of those initiatives have actually been coming from the ramp and the cargo warehouses. They've been coming from people who are having to deal with live problems day to day, and finding solutions on the hoof for those problems.
Well, that's certainly the truth. I think we've seen the same thing of people reacting within 24 hours of things they never even saw before. One thing, Steve, you're handling a lot of buildings where the GHAs are present. They must have been going through a lot with
Yes.
that decrease in passenger flights, and they must have been horrible for them. What were your experiences, and what were you hearing from them about the buildings on the airport? Were they fit for purpose for all of this? Are we going to be prepared for the next time? Because hopefully it's not, we're not going to be in repetitive pandemics, but there will be another crisis. Who knows what it might be? How did your tenants fare in all this?
You know, it's interesting. I'll speak to that. And they survived, right? But there was a period of triage for 3 to 6 months that impacted them as well as our airport partners. And one of the things that I think was unique from our perspective is we were between tenants that were struggling with keeping up with the demands that were thrust upon them. And then the airport side, particularly those that had large passenger volumes and retail operations that just went to zero overnight. And the biggest kind of challenge for us was reconciling the absolute crisis. And I think it passed after about 6 months. People were concerned about revenues. People were concerned about paying rent. People were concerned on the airline side. I think speak for Stephanie that was one of the original shocks, right? When your retailers and everybody suddenly is out of business, literally. What do you do? And I think to Stewart's point, there were a lot of decisions made at the local level that we were very close to that supported airports, supported our tenants. In the initial period, Stan, it wasn't really about the buildings as much as it was about we can't pay rent. What can you do to help us out for this interim period? We were able to structure transactions that got 3, 6, 9 months down the road that I would say were hugely appreciated by folks that needed it, and that weren't waivers of rent, but just deferrals, all of which have been repaid. Everybody is caught up. And I share that with you because the air cargo business really picked up 3 to 6 months into the crisis. Once the initial triage was completed by our tenant base and our airport partners, cargo got really busy. People needed additional space. The one thing that I can share that I think was, and this isn't a surprise, but was lacking the volumes of cargo early on and kind of the chunky nature of it as people were getting on their feet in terms of schedules created a lack of trailer storage and truck maneuvering and all of that on the land side. And I know we've talked about it a little bit in the past, and in theory, through technology and offsite truck queuing and all of that, we really shouldn't be using a huge amount of airside space for trailer storage or truck queuing. But I can tell you during the crisis, it was nice where we had space and our tenants had space for those operations versus constrained environments. So in terms of the buildings themselves, I think they were fine, right? The communication systems, the transparency of what was going on. There are certainly some design considerations that we'll take forward, but I think it was economic and it was operational more than really how did our buildings hold up. I think our buildings held up quite well. And I think we're going to talk a little bit later on kind of the evolution of what's the air cargo facilities function within its tenant base and airport, and how do those things change over time. But candidly, I think those things were changing irrespective of CV-19. There was a lot going on in terms of what is the future of air cargo, what is the role of an air cargo facility pre-CV. It was largely e-commerce driven and technology driven. So those things may be paused for 6 to 9 months, but I would suggest they're coming back full force with a new appreciation for how important cargo is.
Oh, it really has raised the profile of cargo, fortunately, after 50 years of trying to get it there.
Right.
Mammen, you were right in the middle of really massive investments in Edmonton on developing the airport. I mean, I'm just looking behind you with that 124. My picture is at 225, so I've got you beat. I've got 6 engines, you've only got 4. So, but anyway, it's a fantastic airport, and you're right smack in the middle of all of your transition into really a super hub up in Canada here. How were you prepared for all of this onslaught, I imagine, of charters, which you weren't expecting, and especially if you were offloading loose PPE in one of those Antonovs? It must have been quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Stan. And you know, the 124 behind me is actually a good example of one of those situations. So we had a particular day, and similar to what we heard from Stephanie in Philadelphia, Edmonton was also impacted by not being an airport that was permitted to accept passenger flights. So there was quite a dramatic, drastic, immediate shutdown of passenger traffic. The advantage, of course, from an Edmonton airport perspective that helped us in many ways was that investment in cargo leading up to essentially what happened over the last few years. And it feels odd almost doing a post-mortem because I feel like we're continuing to live it. I don't think we're past it just yet. We're still continuing to learn lessons. It's really when all the investments to date were able to be tested and came to prove their value and showcase their worth. Just going back to that Antonov story, we know that it's particularly challenging and particularly pressure. It applies quite a bit of pressure onto facilities or an airport when you've got one or two Antonovs, whether it be a 124 or 225, whatever the case might be. We had a day that stands out in my mind where we actually had 3 on the ground in the same day, and you can imagine the pressures that placed on the facilities across the airport to campus, the ground handlers, and ultimately the people. But and I think what really stood out, and I think Stewart mentioned this, was talking about the people. As much as there were these horror stories of handling, the reality is there were these stories of triumph. I think people coming together and finding ways to satisfy this need, despite this drastic shift in the type of activity, going back to charters, like you said, where some of the regular scheduled activity wasn't really taking place. With no exaggeration, in early days, we had freighters, we had aircrafts on short final lining up to land, and our ground handlers were not informed of where those airplanes were even inbound, and customs agents that were trying to coordinate information between the various stakeholders, and then we're continuing to see some of that take place. But I think that what that revealed, and that was in the early days, was almost immediately after we brought together all the stakeholders, in many cases including competitors, to be quite honest, and brought everyone together. And the reality is our experience was largely harmonious, and I'm happy to say, and obviously this is a compliment to the many partners that we have on airport, and I know this wasn't the case at all airport sites, as an example. I guess the task for us now, the challenge, is how we continue to maintain that level of dialogue, that level of integration, that level of engagement and cooperation in the future, and make sure that is the new baseline, not this isolated response to a particular incident. The other thing that I really want to mention, I think we think about the last. It's going to be coming up to 24 months here very soon, but the last little while, I think it really, you talked about the vaccines and the PPE and other things like that, and Stephanie talked about the role that an airport plays as an economic driver. I think that it reminded a lot of folks about the role that cargo plays in the daily lives. And I think on the same vein, not just the role it plays, but the obligation we have to continue investing in this aspect of our business.
That brings up one interesting point. I'd like to hear your opinions on this. Did anything stand out in your mind, maybe 1 or 2 items that there must be a better way to handle this? I mean, did we learn for the future? I mean, not just handling a pandemic, but handling air cargo, because it's obvious from some of the studies I've been doing recently. I mean, there's no doubt now that cargo has to be treated by a core business, by airlines, if they want to survive, because it just has to. Because the revenue contribution is no longer ancillary revenue. It has to be core business, and or else we're not going to see many of those wide bodies making money anymore. But did anything stand out in your mind out there that there must be a better way to do this in the future based on this experiences we learned? Maybe we could have a couple of items from each of you. Stephanie?
We need to go digital, and we need to do it quickly. We need to be faster and efficient. For sure. And it's, going to your point, Stan, it's interesting. I do both air service and cargo, and a lot of my business cases to the airlines have shifted from being primarily focused on passenger numbers, and stimulation rates, to being really based on cargo. So it'll be interesting to see if that trend continues, but I'd say definitely speed and efficiency. Let's go digital as quickly as possible.
It's interesting you say that, because one of our customers is a rather large investor, not Goldman Sachs, by the way, Steve, but he was telling us they were doing some site interviews with an airline. He said for the first time ever, the cargo people were in the same room, and he said that never happened before. And I was so happy he told me that. What about you, Stewart? Do you have any advice or do you have anything that stuck out in your mind that you said, now that we've been through this, we got to do this a better way? Oh, you're on mute, Stewart. I knew I'd get to say that before the
Yeah,
end
you
of
know,
the show.
we've been doing this for 18 months and I still get it wrong. Yeah, well, I think actually picking up on Stephanie's point, it's a point that Mam made as well. I mean, with all respect to Philadelphia and Edmonton, these are airports which have taken cargo seriously for a long time. But there's a number of airports which, frankly, cargo has been a real low priority. And it's been quite interesting talking to airport directors over the last 18 months, kind of saying, yeah, we need to think differently. We need to develop cargo. And I think that's really encouraging, that more airports are putting it higher up the agenda. The question is, you know, and we're starting to see, you know, the passenger flights come back now. Will that be a flash in the pan, or will that prioritization remain? And I don't know the answer to that. The optimistic side of me says, I think a lot of people have learned a lesson and will change. Let's hope so.
Oh, one thing on that statement, I think if they would stop thinking that air freight means freighters and realize about the passenger contribution, the contribution to passenger basic business that cargo is for them, they're going to have to think about it. What about you, Mammen? And you're on mute.
I got it just in time. I know, but very similar to what Stephanie and Stewart mentioned, Stan. I think that the key thing here is to make sure for airports and airlines and other stakeholders to recognize the value that comes in building business resiliency. I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the sustainability ambitions that as an industry we're facing, and part of that is economic financial sustainability, which means further diversification of business. And I think that applies both from an airline and an airport perspective. And I think Stewart is on to something when we talk about the fact that there is the potential to treat this as an isolated response, and perhaps redirect efforts back to the passenger side of the business. And I think that there's going to be a concerted effort that's going to need to be taken by industry to continue to reinforce the value that that air cargo has to our communities. And it's not just our business models, but to our communities, to serve our communities. It keeps households functioning, it keeps businesses moving, and making sure that that focus doesn't dissipate is going to be something we're all going to need to work collectively together on.
Steve, one of the things I saw in the last 24 months is that cargo didn't dwell in warehouses anymore because it was so urgent. It had to go through and get through fast.
Yep.
I'm going to go into digitization in a moment, Stephanie, because it's a hot button for me, as you know. But Steve, I mean, what lessons did you learn from that? I mean, the fact is that if we can move PPE and vaccines through warehouses as quickly as we did, why can't we move shoes through just as fast?
Well, I'm going to pick up on a theme that all three of the other panelists mentioned, and it's efficiency, communication, decision-making, procurement, all of those things. And while I think there's some risk that, and understandably, that the major airports that have significant passenger volumes, let's face it, some of the attention has to go back to bringing the passengers back, serving the local communities and the regions for passenger travel and all of that. But I think it's incumbent upon us as an industry, and I mean us, mostly airports, third-party investors and developers, to continue to evolve better communication, more efficient communication. There was a real fork in the road, in my opinion, between the airports that were fairly far up the curve and fairly nimble and fairly able to make decisions, and those that weren't. And I would like to see one thing that comes out of all this being a shortening of the procurement cycle, candidly. And if somebody comes up with a great idea and has money to invest to bring value to an airport, well, there was an open mind to that in certain airports during the crisis. I hope that carries forward. It shouldn't take 3 years to make a decision on redevelopment of a fallow piece of land or an air cargo facility or whatever the case may be. 3 months isn't a crazy goal. There can be transparency, competition, all the things airports need. And I'm hopeful that not only is cargo's importance not forgotten, but the value of communication, decision-making, and expedience kind of, okay, we've got this collective goal, let's get it done, doesn't wane too much, because there are instances within the procurement processes that we deal with that I just hope don't go back to, being 3-year cycles, and 3-month or 6-month cycles would be fantastic, I think, for everybody involved.
Well, the reality is for airports, especially when you consider technology, what I mean by that is when you see the 321 LR and ER, and when you see like the product JetBlue just put on the North Atlantic, their business class product is superior to most.
Yep.
That's going to have a big impact on cargo. And if we don't have facilities rejigged in order to meet the needs of the consumer, which is for speed, transparency, quality, we're finished, because that'll all move to freighters and into small airports where it can be achieved. So it's in our vested interest to speed things up. Stephanie, I'm going back to what you said before, which is, for me, I think the panacea of this industry, which is we're 25 years behind sea freight in technology and digitization. But I think it's going to be taken out of our hands soon. And I'm happy to say you've all heard from Courtney at ICAO, but I do participate in a couple of UN and ICAO panels on this. One of them has just been authorized and starting up soon on data corridors for air logistics for trade facilitation. But a major issue at the moment is cybersecurity, safety and security, with so many e-commerce people delivering shipments, which the scrutiny of them is going to be really a micro issue for all governments around the world, et cetera, et cetera. So digitization, with regulatory situations for security, with issues on safety, has a lack of, or in your case, the use of systems from the past, they just weren't there. And the worst case scenario is everybody was in a silo trying to have a unique selling point of their own, without the common good being taken care of, which means that your airport suffers or your handling company suffers, because if everybody does their own thing and they fail, you lose the business and your airports lose the airlines. What would you like to see in the coming, short period, so we're prepared for what's going to hit us anyways from ICAO and the UN? Stephanie?
Well, selfishly, I'd love to see our procurement process finished so that we can get an ACCS installed. Because Steve, I do agree with you. There's a difference sometimes between what we as executives in an airport want to see happen really, really quickly and the reality of how long it takes us to make things happen. So it would be nice for us to finish our procurement process and get our ACCS up and running. But I think airports, it's important for us to have it, but all of our airport partners need to have it as well. So hopefully more airports in the US and in North America will start to implement them so we can all be connected as quickly as possible.
I think that's really important. If I could jump in, Stan, the network benefits, and I don't know what the inflection point is. Is it 5 gateways? Is it 2 gateways and 15 tertiary airports? In the United States, there'll become a point where it all starts to work as a virtual circle. It's just, how do we get there, right? How does the private sector fund it to the extent we're asked to participate in the capital costs? How does the airport know they're picking the right system and the right partners? And we really need, I think, to make a leap of faith at some point within the next few months or year or so. And if it doesn't work out perfectly, don't abandon it. Say, hey, it didn't work out exactly the way we wanted it to. How do we fix it? Because it has to happen, right? And it's just, and hopefully there's a lot of discussion, obviously, among groups like this. And I think more broadly through some of the institutions you're working with, Stan, and that all of us are working with, we need to continue to spread the word that we have to stop kind of navel gazing on these things. We know the value is there. We know we need to get the United States, the airports in the United States, caught up on the 20 or 25 years that they may be behind. And let's just get going on it.
Well, you know, the interesting thing and is that you won't have a choice pretty soon. So, you know, the best time to change is when times are good.
Correct.
Now,
Figure it out on your own before somebody's telling you how you're going to figure it out.
Precisely, and you can have an input now. Stewart, you've worked with airports that have this. I mean, you know, the U.S. and Canada are just embarking. I mean, it's like pulling teeth from a hen, as they say, but we're getting there. But you've dealt with cargo community systems, for example. You've dealt with airlines that are fully digitized and introduced products that require it. Emirates is a perfect example, with Emirates Delivers and other products that wouldn't exist without digitization. You work with Amsterdam with Cargonaut, you work with UAE, etc. What's your feeling about airports that don't embrace this quickly?
Well, the cargo systems which can provide digitization and all the transparency that would go with that, they are going to have a huge competitive advantage over those that don't. I mean, you know, for example, where I used to live in Dubai, there is a single cargo community system, and that's easier to do in Dubai because there is a kind of a more holistic approach to aviation. And there is also the one handling agent, so everything can go through the one system, and it really works. And you know, and effectively, that's what the integrators do, isn't it?
Yes.
And you know, and the clue's in the title. That's why they're called integrators, because they offer an integrated product. And you know the legacy carriers will struggle to compete with that until we can get a kind of common systems. But it is very hard to do because it requires different parties to come together. You know, from a handler perspective, there may be 4 handlers all wanting, you know, all with their own systems. Maybe it has to be in some ways the airports that take the lead on that, I think, almost to impose or enforce a way of working.
That's a good point.
And you know, and ultimately maybe we end up with a, you know, 1 or 2 systems which then evolve into industry systems.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, anyways, the airports are key to this, and they're there to serve the airlines. And the airlines they want to attract and keep need it to make money. And if they need it to make money, meaning profitability on the cargo side, I agree with you. The airports have to put their foot down on these things. What about you, Mammen? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I want to pick right up on what Stewart was saying there about the integrators. You know, decades ago, isn't, you know, FedEx famously said the data about the package is more valuable than the package itself, and I think there's you know, that there's value continues to present itself, you know, decades later. But you know, and again, I think Stewart, you know, set me up nicely there from an airport perspective, you know, taking the role in moving forward. The reality is that the airports are those sites where all these handoffs occur, and the coordination between, you know, the different modes of transport, the different stakeholders, where those activities take place. So we've seen how those investments by the integrated carriers have paid off, and they've been able to benefit largely. And it's no secret that in large cases sometimes disruption occurs from outside, and so I think with the legacy carriers, as we've previously identified, the reality is that the airports can provide that platform where there's a single source of truth and a common approach to how to tackle some of that digitization. I think we've seen investments in the digitization, the movement of some goods and some commodities like pharmaceuticals, perishables, and things like that. And clearly it has supported the growth of those verticals in the industry. So finding a way to bring that same level of transparency, that same level of investment, and eliminating or sucking out the inefficiencies in general cargo as much as we've done on special cargo is incumbent on us, I would say.
I'd just like to wrap that part of it up with the following. We know about the integrators, and we know from their very name what they do. They integrate, right? A friend of mine, a very senior position, I was talking to him actually on the weekend about something going on over in Germany, and he told me that he spent a lot of time working with Alibaba, and he met with them and spoke to them, And during all the conversations of all the products they had and everything else, he asked him a question, look, what's your core business? And the answer surprised him. And when he told me on the weekend, surprised me as well. They said, our core business is two things. Number one, we pay. That means controlling the finance. The second one is data. And everything is a subset of our data systems, and we pay. Because if we control the data, we control the money, we control everything. Now, that is a blunt, honest opinion. Now, transpose that onto Mr. Bezos, and you'll see it's exactly the same story. He controls with AWS, even the US military uses it, Formula One uses it. So he's got his act together on the data, and we know where the money's coming from, right? So it's not just the integrators. And if the airports want to support and the GHAs want to support their airlines to have some shot at being competitive, it's got to come. That's a great thing. I mean, to get this going. But I'd like to now address a few issues that are I think relevant here, and I'll focus on right now, Steve, on you with AFCO, and it obviously relates to the airports. But you're used to probably negotiating with airports, and you know, I've, over the years I've been involved in a lot of cases where you're talking about a land lease or something similar, then getting used to the land for build, operate, transfer, let's say 25, 35, 40 years or whatever. And then I imagine not what's much else was demanded from the airports in the past than just pay me my rent, make sure you're on time, and go away. I don't want to see you anymore except take your money, right? And, and I can name airports where I could tell you that still exists. Have you seen a change in attitude from the airports, the airlines wanting more, needing more than from you than that? Because if you're going to be a marketing tool, how are you going to do that if that relationship between you and the airports doesn't change?
Yeah, I mean, the unequivocal answer to the question is yes, there's been a sea change in the last 3 to 5 years in terms of how airports approach the relationship with AFCO and kind of the third party investor developer sector as a whole. And they're expecting more. The initial focus, candidly, always seems to be economics. And I would like to see that evolve a little bit more to include the broader marketing, the broader service kind of delivery that a given airport can provide to its customer base. And it's not just about how much can we squeeze out of the third-party developer. In my view, it should be about how can we embrace third-party developer as a partner. You know, one of the things we've been saying for the last 3 to 5 years in proposals is we want to participate in Jumpstart. We want to participate in routes. We don't want to see the airport once a year when we're just kind of catching up annually or on an ad hoc basis if there's an issue between us and the airport or us and a tenant where, you know, some discussion needs to take place. I think it needs to be much more regular. When Stephanie is out pitching someone in Europe for wide body passenger service, she should have somebody, I would argue, with her to pitch belly cargo capability, ground handling capabilities, and all of that. And sure, there has to be some sharing between the two parties there in terms of economics, but I think it needs to be focused as much on we want to create value at the airport versus how am I going to make sure I extract maximum value from the developer for that facility, right? It's much more broad than that, is my point. That's obviously become very clear to the airports that we deal with. And I don't mean to be cynical about it, but I would just suggest that kind of capturing the economics that they perceive we've been able to capture through our risk taking on airports is just a piece of it. We took the risks when it worked out well. Maybe airports thought, well, the ground lease should have been higher, but you know, what's the flip side of that when it goes poorly, right? Nobody offered ever to give us, you know, ground rent back or anything along those lines. So I think the economics are super important to continue to be comfortable talking about with some transparency and openness, but it also has to include how can we work together to drive more cargo through the airport, more cargo through my buildings. And, you know, if my tenants are making money, it should be a virtual circle, right? And I think the key to that is communication and more regular interaction.
Well, based on that, then Steve, let me ask now, we talked about integrators a few moments ago, and if I look at this panel, I see an integrator. I see, other than an airline and what maybe one other person I'd like to have on the panel would be a digital solution provider, like air cargo community systems provider, but we don't have them. So let's look at the integration that's possible between the airport, the ground handling company, through the developer. You can fix the system because let's face it, like I said before, if a 777 leaves Hong Kong and arrives in Chicago, it's 14 hours. That's faster than Amazon, faster than Alibaba, faster than FedEx and UPS and all the rest. But we screw it up on the ground. I mean, because we've never organized ourselves. So you are, I have an integrator here in front of me. Stephanie, Mammen and Stewart, how do you see this collaboration or a collaborative approach being possible? How do we fix it so that every discussion with a developer, we're talking about marketing, and value. We're not just talking about one silo meaning price for the land. How do we go about that? Maybe Stewart?
Yeah, thanks, Stan. I think Steve made a really good point about the kind of the more holistic marketing of an airport. And I've been involved in route planning with 2 different airlines, long-haul airlines, where, on a typical long-haul route, cargo revenue is 10, 12% of the total revenue. Now, there's very, very few routes which make a 10% margin. So on most routes, that cargo revenue is the difference between making money and losing money for the airline. And somehow that very basic fact gets lost somehow. And I'm not sure if every airport director really realizes that, because if they did, maybe they would act differently. But coming back to I think one of the challenges that we've had in the last 18 months has been about capacity.
Yes.
And there's probably not a single head of cargo in an airline. And I think all of the ground handlers at some point have had their head in their hands in the last 18 months with service failures, letting down customers because of capacity problems. So there is and those capacity problems have always been bubbling under the surface, but it's kind of it's the events of the last 18 months have kind of tipped us over the edge in some cases. And we really need to think about how we generate more capacity on airports for cargo. I've had several heads of cargo and airlines saying, please, can we put more capacity into this airport? And we would love to put more capacity in, but the numbers don't add up, literally. The economics, to come back to Steve's word, the economics don't work because the rentals just literally don't add up when you compare it with the yields in the market. So those business cases to develop those cargo facilities just don't add up. And therefore, I think what it needs is coming back to exactly what Steve and Stephanie said, much more of a sort of a collaborative, holistic approach between airport, developer, and ground handler of, well, how can we make this work?
Yeah.
Well,
now, maybe that means the airport has to take a view, which is, I will take a smaller return on this particular piece of property asset, recognizing the broader value which will be generated, to use Stephanie's term, of the engine of growth that cargo is, and the broader growth to the airport. But I realize those conversations aren't easy in a boardroom either.
One of the things I'd like to jump in here on. Sorry, go ahead, Stephanie.
I was just going to say, one of the things from an airport perspective is, at the end of the day, the airport is only as successful as all of the partners on the airport. And that is a big difference, I think, between the airports that have realized that and have changed the way that they perceive and go about partnerships, and ultimately will be more successful, because you can't do it by yourself, right? an airport is the infrastructure, right? And we have to have the runways, and we have to have the space, and we have to have the buildings. But if our tenants aren't happy, if our tenants aren't in the right place in the airport, if our tenants aren't going out into the market with the same messaging that the airport is, there's massively lost opportunities. And so the more an airport can work to bring everyone together, to get everyone thinking about the same strategic goals, the more successful everybody is going to be, right? Not just the airport, but the ground handler, the airlines, everybody that is involved in the ecosystem. And that's a change. And it's, Stewart and Steve, to your point, it's sometimes the airport saying, you know what, this building needs investment. I can't do it. So I'm going to take a lower rent on it to let somebody come in, help me attract new carriers. I will end up making it on landing fees or somewhere else, or really helping, generate economy for my region. So it's really about changing the way that you deal with your partnerships and trying to be a lot more collaborative.
Mammen, you were going to say something.
I mean, it's going to be very similar to what we've been hearing from the rest of the panelists. And, one of the things that I'm really pleased about, and again, quite fortunate to have a very strong cargo team at the Edmonton airport, very passionate, very invested in this area. One of the things that I think is interesting, and you think about the rethink of the role that cargo plays, one of the things that really stand out for me is all of the metrics, the KPIs from a cargo performance perspective at the Edmonton airport, at least speaking specifically, falls under our community investment portfolio, which is really interesting if you think about that, because it changes the types of conversations that you have and the types of economics that are expected or demanded of these investments and the focus of this area. So cargo lives under community investment, and that changes the types of conversations that we can have. One that is more holistic, because just as Stephanie and Stewart and Steve pointed out, it isn't just of course the hard assets, the runways and the aprons and facilities, which absolutely are required. We need to make sure our planes can land and take off safely. But it is also, in addition to that, the commercial opportunity that exists in the market. It's also talking about the capabilities from a capacity perspective that Stewart said, some of the conversations he's having. It's not just, do you have a parking position available for me at 9 a.m.? It is the parking position available? Are the ground handlers available and capable to service that position? Is the cargo able to move through a facility, hopefully not get stuck, but hopefully through a facility that has the capability and the capacity? And of course, do the shippers and the consignees have a need and a capability to support this additional capacity in the service? So I think it's more of that integrated, more holistic approach. And Stephanie, talked about earlier, the types of conversations taking place with the carriers, and the business cases are of course changing, where cargo is playing a more prominent role. And I would argue that prominent role isn't just of the commercial opportunity that exists, but the operational capabilities, the community support, and all of the other factors that come to making a route successful and help those margins. And as Stewart said, push it from one that's break even or perhaps not profitable to one that is in fact profitable.
In the end, I'd just like to sum it up, because I got a few other questions before we wrap up. But in the end, the only way, Stewart, that the airlines can make enough money to pay for all this is if they can introduce products that are competitive. Let's face it.
Yeah.
And to be competitive today, to meet the consumer demand, to meet just what you want. When you order something on Amazon, you want it tomorrow. And if you can't, you'll go to another supplier.
Yeah.
And if we don't provide those products as a team, and here I'm talking about airport, I'm talking about developers who build the proper buildings, and I'm talking about the GHAs. If we don't, and I'm not talking just about in your particular airport, you also have to start thinking about pairing up with other airports, because if you're going to create data corridors, which is what UN and ICAO want, we have to also produce logistics corridors, so that what goes in one end comes out at the other end with the same degree of speed, transparency, and quality. And obviously at a decent unit price based on what the product is. So the only way I can see this happening, because we have a separate panel discussion on collaboration. We have the traditional IATAs, ICAOs, and all the rest of them. But quite frankly, it doesn't get down into the weeds like the airports can by talking to each other, like the GHAs, if they would move off trying to build proprietary systems that give them a unique selling point, and maybe for 20-30% of the time start thinking of the greater good of the airport and your airline customers. And then Steve, when it comes to being able to handle these products, we need the buildings that can do it. And that's not the old rectangular buildings on the flight line, 20 feet deep and 8,000 feet long. That doesn't work anymore, right? So
I agree.
how do we wrap this up by saying, maybe this is something we should take to next year's conference as something we would like to bring up next year, that we spent a year running a few trial cases. Maybe we can have Edmonton working with Stephanie, with a strategic consultant of Stewart, and Steve got there building buildings because the procurement's changed to 1 month instead of 3 years. That's our objective for 2022. All right.
Okay, I'll sign up to that.
Absolutely.
So can I just add something to that? I'm not an expert in banking, but as I understand it, you have banks all around the world who have their own proprietary systems, but somehow all banks talk to each other. You can transfer money from one to another. So somehow the banking system seems to have created this, so it's not beyond the wit of man, surely, that it's getting the right people together, isn't it?
I'm going to tell you something. Airlines have done it as well in the passenger division.
Yeah.
So why can't they do it in the cargo?
True.
We really don't learn lessons even from within our own companies. So yes, you're totally right, Stewart, and I appreciate that. So now, basically, we've solved all the world's problems except for one or two. So let's get into those now. And I'm directing this more at Stephanie and Mammen, I guess. This is interesting now, is the things that really never come up on the radar in a normal conversation we've talked about today, such as AFCO saying that, they're prepared to build the buildings, but, we can't wait 3 years to get approval to do it, because today their customers, the GHAs, are saying, and like Stewart just said, give me space, I'll bring in airplanes. So why should it take 3 years to get approval, right? So if the GHAs now are on board, if the facilities can be designed so that cargo doesn't dwell, there's efficiencies to be had through digitization, and there's also efficiencies to be had through automation, which requires, in most cases, new buildings. I guess going back, Stewart, to all of your experiences, in some places we don't need this high degree of automation because of the local airport, but in others we do. And in particular, I'm thinking about airports that call themselves hubs. We have to start handling e-commerce with the speed that we do passenger baggage, or else you're not competitive any longer. I mean, you can't tell me somebody flying from Hong Kong to London nonstop is going to be worried about a threat from cargo transiting through the Gulf or transiting through the Southeast Asian hub, because you're adding on a day or two just to that. So now that we know that, what would you like to say, I guess, to a GHA when you're talking and a developer? What would you like to say, Stephanie and Mammen, to both parties about, look, if you want to be on my airport, this is what you've got to deliver, or I'm not interested in having you, I'll choose another developer. What would both of you, what's a message you would have for all the AFCOs of this world as to what you want from them?
I can get started maybe, and Stephanie, I'm sure you'll have some additional thoughts. I think as we talked about over the last hour, Stan, as airport operators, we owe it to our communities to extract the maximum productivity out of our assets, out of our facilities, and that means working with partners, like-minded partners that are equally vested in integrating these capabilities, whether it be into their design, their facilities, into their fleets, their equipment, their resources. So I think that from that perspective, finding like-minded partners that buy into that vision of utilizing the airport platform as the facilitator of pushing that change, I think is a type of conversation that has to take place and is taking place. As we've heard already, the kinds of conversation that airports are having with the developers that are investing on their sites and the ground handlers and the airlines are reflecting that desire to step up and reflect this new pace of business and type of business. And you mentioned it earlier, the type of activity that's taking place in these facilities is changing. It's changing drastically. And I think it was Steve that mentioned earlier on the panel about the speed of business, being able to implement that more, previously seen in technology firms, that agile approach where it's a little bit more incremental. It doesn't need to be fully baked. It's incremental change. Yep. Get to the 80%, make adjustments, and respond to changing circumstances and consumer expectations. So I think that as airport operators, we owe it to our communities and our airline partners and the rest of the partners to find like-minded partners that are equally vested in integrating these capabilities and these digital elements that exist today.
Yeah, I'd like to take that one step further, Stephanie, before you answer. I firmly believe in this, so I'm prejudiced, but I'm gonna give you this statement to think about and give a comment on. Based on everything that Mammen has just said, I think that an airport should go one step further. I think you should mandate that when a developer wants to have a building or redevelop a building, that they come in with the tenant, or at least the KPIs and SLAs that the tenant are going to be forced to implement. You should mandate that they have to have a participation in the cargo community system. It's not optional. You can have your own system, but the community needs this. Therefore, it's a mandate. And either that or go away and we'll get somebody else. Now, on top, obviously, from the developer side of building the right building fit for purpose for that particular airport. What's your opinion on what Mammen just said, and also my statement, which, like I said, I'm prejudiced. So
I don't think I could have said it better than what I said before. When you're looking for a good partnership, you better be aligned in your mission, in your vision, and your way of doing work. And from an airport's perspective, you really need to make sure that whoever this partnership is with, that they really believe in your product and your area, and that they're going to go out and fight for it, and that they are going to be a good representation of what you want your airport to be. If you come in and you take over a building and your ramp area is a disaster and you are unorganized and dirty and other tenants are complaining and you are not representing what the airport wants to put out into the world in that marketing message. So you need to be really, really aligned. And again, there's strength in those partnerships when you are aligned and you go out and you can really be aggressive in how you market the airport and the facilities. And at the end of the day, then everybody wins. So I think that is incredibly important. And Stan, I love your ideas. Mandate is probably a little bit of a strong word that some of my tenants would
not for me.
Disagree with, but I think that the important part is bringing them into the conversation early enough that they understand it, so that you don't have to mandate it, that they get it and they want to participate, and because they're aligned with your mission and your vision and your way of thinking, are wanting to participate. It's always better when everybody's on the same page and it's a win for everybody instead of forcing or mandating.
Well, I'm in a different position. I think of everyone on this panel is a business card for an airline. I'm being CEO of a couple of airlines, and Passage Side being on board of directors and all this. You are my calling card. I mean, if a passenger that flies on my airline comes into your airport and it's exactly like you said, it's a mess and it's dirty and the washrooms aren't clean, and in cargo, if my cargo sits there for a long time, gets damaged, there's claims and all the rest of it, my business card as an airline is represented in you. And I have no problem with the word mandate, but that's me. I'm old school. You're next gen. I guess then maybe so we can wrap this up. I mean, I could go on for days talking about this because it's just such a stimulating product. But do you have any last thoughts or any specific plans or exciting news you can share with us on well, we've talked about it all, but are you actually doing it? Stewart, maybe you could, I know you can't legally speak about Donata, but you can certainly tell us, because I mean, I have great respect for Donata.
I'm going to address that, but also trying to respond to Stephanie's point. And I mean, there's a debate whether you talk about mandating or self-regulation, but it may surprise you, but as a ground handler, I actually welcome the idea of the setting of minimum standards and the enforcement of those minimum standards. And I would like to think that the quality ground handlers would support that. Partly because it's the right thing to do, but if yes, I can't speak on behalf of Donata now, but over the last 18 months, Donata has invested heavily in automation around the cargo area. And that's not just about customer service, that's about safety as well. So, if I was running an airport, I would want to be encouraging self-regulating, mandating, depending how far you go, but things like, the automation of dangerous good checking. It really shouldn't be done manually anymore. It should be automated. Weight and dim checks, should be automated to reduce the risk of error. These are very important safety points. And I would welcome airports having a dialogue with handlers about setting minimum standards, but also those minimum standards could cover things like sustainability. Why wouldn't you say, right, you can come in as a tenant, but no single-use plastics?
That's interesting what you said, Stewart, because I can tell you, Stephanie, I have a pretty good network. Two of the major competitors of Donata have told me the same thing. Why doesn't the airport just mandate it? And then that stops all this argument. Yeah. And so I wouldn't be so, you could change the word, but the point is from the airport point of view, we all want something better, and we want a more sustainable and both on an economic sense and environmental sense future. So why wouldn't we? And I'm sure Steve would welcome it as well, because if he knows what he has to comply with, then he knows what kind of buildings to build and also what he has to do to get it going. No, that's a terrific comment, and maybe my word mandate's too strong, but not from my point of view. So,
well, I think there's a difference between what you can mandate for somebody who's coming in and you're starting from scratch, right? And somebody who's been on airport property for 60, 70 years. And I guess my comment was more towards the current tenants that have been there forever, that I feel like you get further with current tenants when you bring them into the process really early on and you get them to believe in what you're trying to do. Effectively, you're mandating it, but you're not saying from, in 24 hours, you have to do what I say. You bring them into a collaborative process so they understand the value of it and they believe in it. It's a different story when you're starting from scratch from somebody and you're drafting up a lease for the first time. Where you can have some stronger language. It's just a little bit of a different way of approaching partnerships when they're long-standing partnerships.
Yeah. Well, you can still mandate. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Stewart.
I say you can mandate, but I think it only works if that mandate is after a sort of sensible, grown-up discussion about what is realistic.
Precisely, and let's face it, certain things like safety and security, etc., we have to have it. And also, and I'm sure you all share the same experience when it comes to certain parts of the processes of what we do. For example, you mentioned weight and balance. Well, and Steve, that means you'll have to have 20-foot scales, for example, that talk to the system, or else, head office in Dubai, in Donata or Qatar or whatever it is, can't check the weight and balance and be sure that there's no mistakes. All this stuff we'd be here for 3 days talking about all this.
Yep.
Look, I have to wrap up now because we're pretty well running out of time, but I asked you at the beginning, and I love this comment you just made, Stewart and Stephanie, about the fact that we should have minimum standards. And maybe that's an objective for next year, and maybe we could look as a group, and meaning we'll take that challenge on as part of this panel. Maybe we should have some minimum standards. We have minimum standards, dictated IOSA standards and things like this. But what we don't have is the interaction minimum standards between the people we need to make an integrated product possible on the airport and community good over not just individual proprietary system good. So with that, do you want to share with me any thoughts on what you would like to see next year being something we worked on this year or stimulated through the publication Cargo Airports and Services magazine or something like that we stimulated the industry to talk about based on what we've talked about today? Steve, do you have anything you would like to see, because you're involved in a lot of airports?
Sure.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just pick up on kind of the theme that I think has permeated the last few minutes of discussion. KPIs, performance standards, all of that are really important, but they have to be developed with the airlines and the handlers and the developer, particularly if a third-party development model is selected. You can't just put it in the RFP for the cargo facility and let the developer figure it out and hope he or she can articulate in the proposal how they're going to deliver these things. It has to start with what are the goals, what are reasonable. You have to talk to the folks that are currently operating at your airport, figure out what they're willing to share, what they're not, what's just not going to come in the initial kind of run at this, and recognize that you're going to get to where you want to be incrementally. You have to start somewhere, right? And maybe there are 30 KPIs we all would love to have and only 5 or 7 that are plausible to get in the immediate future. That's okay, right? There are mechanisms every year, every 3 years through rules and regulations and all the other things that airports can do that we can do within our leases. If the airport promulgates an additional, KPA as required, we can put that in our facility lease. You can put it in your ground lease with us, but we have to talk about it, to make sure we're all on the same page. And I think Stephanie made the point on the value proposition, particularly to legacy airlines or legacy tenants, has to be proven very, very clearly, right? And they may not believe it at first, but if you can get their peer group making more money, creating value for their shippers or receivers, whatever the case may be, I think eventually you can get people on board. So I think it's definitely a specific topic worthy of discussion. We often see RFPs that are asking for KPIs, and you ask the airport, where did you come up with these? Who's currently, are you doing this at all? What is your current experience? And 9 times out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, they're not doing any of it. They want the developer to figure it out on this particular building, and it just doesn't work, right? It has to be an airport-wide, fully communicated, collaborative messaging program. And I don't think it takes years. It takes a few months possibly, but if everybody's like-minded and willing to put some effort and speculating some time and money, kind of promoting the effort, I think we can get there as an industry. But it definitely, it's a standalone topic that I would encourage noodling over and figuring out how you make it a specific discussion point next year or whenever.
That's a good one. I appreciate it. Mammen.
Absolutely. I mean, Stan, it's funny. We've had some conversation about this. It's come up a few times over the panel. And when I'm thinking about the conversation about enforcing minimum standards, something that comes into mind, a bit of by way of an update. So we're undergoing the largest cargo expansion right now in our history, including a ramp, apron for 7 freighter parking positions and facilities. Through the design and procurement process, there was an expectation that certain factors would be considered, including for example, concrete being poured would be carbon neutral, as an example. In design of the facilities, working together with the developers and the tenants of these facilities on what the requirements and what the design parameters would be to ensure that the facility could cater to, for example, an all-electric fleet. Integration of solar panels or being self-sufficient from an energy perspective, including things like drone logistics as well, integrating into the facilities as an example, to make sure that so we're pushing the needle in the facilities as being future-proof. So the theme there that I want to grab onto, though, and I think it's going to be one that continues to be of importance for all of us around the table, is that sustainability piece that you mentioned earlier. earlier, it's from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, from the governance perspective of airports, is making sure that we're working together to meet those ambitions that we have as an industry to decarbonize our activities and our businesses. So I think that's something that we have to talk more about more meaningfully as we come out of what we are, just to make sure that these sustainability initiatives, and of course digitization is a key component in that, that these sustainability initiatives are embedded in the type of partners that we attract, we promote, and we support in the airport ecosystem.
A couple of things I notes for myself sort of thing is economic and environmental sustainability. I am amazed when you do a deep dive on digitization of how much you can impact positively your environmental impact obligations and objectives. It's amazing. And as far as economic, how much you can cut costs, and I don't mean cutting people, I mean reducing the dwell time, pushing things through faster with digitization. Also, it's economically beneficial in cost reduction and efficiency. So I'm going to put environmental and economic sustainability as an objective of how we can get the GHA developer and airport community together. Stephanie, any thoughts?
Better communication and better partnerships. How can we as an industry take advantage of this moment in time and not let cargo go backwards to being sort of the forgotten child? And that is going to mean all of us working together. And I say this to airports all the time. Yes, we are competitors, but we're also partners. If Philadelphia and Edmonton can work together to get a service, we both win, right? There needs to be a larger mentality of thinking about working together with all of our partners so that we're all successful.
So if we're going to have a data corridor concept that mandated on us from the UN and from ICAO, then we should work towards a logistics thinking as well between airports and GHAs and developers. Would that be a fair point that we'd like to see?
Absolutely.
Okay, terrific. And Stewart.
Well, I think the guys have said it all, actually. I mean, you're right. I mean, the three main headings in the ICAO report were digitalization, automation, and sustainability. And I'm really glad that Mammen raised sustainability. And I'd love to see how those three can all be brought into minimum standards.
Well, that would be great. You know, I'd just like to recap something that, you know, Des Vertanis normally would be doing this, and I'm sort of helping him out. I'm going to make him buy me dinner for this, by the way. But I've enjoyed chatting with you all. But we were chatting as we always do. We're him, Mammen, and myself. We're called the Three Amigos. We were talking about some old IATA statistics, and it would be interesting for you. I don't know if you know this. They did a survey once with the PAX IS and the Cargo IS systems that IATA has, and cargo was 11% of the pie, first class 4% of the pie, business 14%, and economy class 71% of the airline revenue. And they spend more money on first class lounges and first class services than they do on cargo in the boardrooms. I know it. I was in the boardroom. So that's interesting. It sort of sums up the way the past was. We got to make sure that changes, because certainly those numbers don't apply post-COVID, and we got to get cargo to the forefront. Lady, gentlemen, thank you so much. I mean, this is a powerhouse of knowledge and also entrepreneurial thinking, and you applied it in your airports. Steve, I know in talking to you in the past, you're a developer that gets it. I hope I selfishly hope your competitors get it as well. And Stewart, you're not going anywhere, because I'm going to keep bugging you. You cannot retire on me. You just can't. You're not allowed. So I'm going to be driving you nuts, even if I have to go to Edinburgh to do it. Mammen, you know, if you move your head, you'll see that's a Volga and Epper airplane. So not only LM, you stuck a Volga and Epper airplane in there as well. You had to rub it in, didn't you? All right.
It was representing the response during the crisis. So
right. Well, I'm in regular communication with them as well, so that's good. Thank you very much. We have to wrap it up now. Unfortunately, like I said, if we really got going on this, it would be superb to do it face to face. I really would like to invite you all next year to Rome. and join us, because I think, just sitting sometimes in the lobby and chatting informally, you can also pick up a lot of good ideas. Thanks once again. Really appreciate it. And it was a fun time for all, I hope. It gives you all something to think about, and us as well. Thank you very much.